June 6, 1944. Late afternoon in the fields of Normandy, a heavy fog hangs low over the broken landscape. Somewhere, the faint toll of a church bell echoes once, then falls silent. Inside the cramped interior of a Sherman tank, Private Joe Johnson, 22 years old, feels sweat trickling down his back. The smell of metal, oil, and fear fills the air. His fingers grip the gear shift tightly. The explosion of a shell reverberates through the metal, the shockwave of dirt and debris crashing into their compartment. His crew is shouting. The gun's jammed. The hatch won't open. And then, through the smoke ahead, comes the unmistakable roar. The ground shakes with each slow turn of the Tiger tank's tracks. Ellis, the gunner, yells, "We can't outrun it." Mitch, the loader, is swearing, slamming the breech to unjam it. The tank commander stares at the fog in front of them, frozen. Somewhere, the Tiger is locking onto them. They expect Joe to rush forward, charge, or at least try to break free. But Joe does something no one anticipates. He shifts the tank into reverse. Without a word, he slams the lever back, and the Sherman jolts into motion. The treads grind against the earth, ripping up dirt and roots as the tank lurches backward into the smoke. The crew screams, not in pain, but in disbelief. "Are you crazy?" they shout. Joe doesn't respond. His eyes remain fixed, his focus unwavering. He watches the side mirrors, calculating every bump, every shadow, every flicker. Beyond the fog, the Tiger moves, slow, steady, unstoppable. What Joe does next will change everything. In the next 10 minutes, using nothing but instinct, courage, and a tactic no manual ever taught, he will destroy two of the most feared tanks of the war, while driving in reverse. And when it's over, he will never drive forward again. Before Normandy, before the Tigers, Joe Johnson was just a farm boy from Seward County, Nebraska. He grew up fixing tractors with his father, studying the mechanics of engines, the way wheels carried weight. He could reverse a John Deere through a chicken coop without touching a single bucket. But that was peace. This was war. When Joe enlisted in 1942, he didn't look like a soldier. Tall, wiry, quiet, and reserved, he didn't drink, didn't gamble, and wasn't loud like the others. In basic training, the guys called him Slowpoke Joe. Later, they dubbed him Backtrack Joe, because he had a habit of backing up his tank in every drill. The sergeants hated it. "Joe, you planning to win the war driving backwards?" One screamed during training in Louisiana. Joe didn't answer. He just kept doing it, backing out of ambushes, reversing through narrow tree lines, always aware of what was behind him. While others charged ahead, Joe would sneak off during breaks and practice reversing his Sherman down gravel roads, learning how to read the terrain in mirrors, to feel the 28-ton shift in reverse. To the unit, it seemed like fear. But what they didn't understand was that Joe wasn't afraid of the enemy. He was afraid of doing something that might get his men killed. And that fear, the right kind of fear, made him careful, precise, and relentless. By the third day after the landings, the French countryside had become a death trap. The narrow lanes were flanked by ancient stone walls, and the field were choked with thickets. Joe's unit, consisting of 4 Shermans and a half-track, had pushed too far ahead. Radio contact with headquarters had cut out. They were supposed to link up with the Canadian column, but the road had vanished behind a collapsed barn. Now, they sat in a clearing, smoke surrounding them, visibility down to just 50 feet. Mitch, the loader, scanned the treetops. "This doesn't feel right." Joe didn't answer. He had already cut the engine. The sudden silence made the crew uneasy. Even the birds had stopped chirping. And then the sound, low, rhythmic, like a hammer pounding the earth. It wasn't one of theirs. Joe froze. He knew that sound. Every tanker did. A Tiger. The German Panzerkampfwagen 6, better known as a Tiger, was the most feared tank in Europe. Weighing over 57 tons, armed with an 88mm gun, and covered in armor thick enough to shrug off anything short of an airstrike. The Tiger was not just a machine. It was a myth, a specter. It was a kind of weapon that turned seasoned tank crews into silent, hunted men. The first shell hit before they even saw it coming. The Sherman on their left, call sign Red 5, erupted in a violent burst of fire and steel. One moment it was there. The next, it was gone torn apart from the side. The crew inside had no chance. Joe's crew ducked instinctively as the shockwave slammed into their own hull. Ellis, the gunner, muttered a curse under his breath. "That wasn't artillery," Mitch said, his voice tight. "That was direct fire. Tiger." Joe didn't need to speak. The answer was clear. He peered through the periscope, scanning the tree line, and there it was, a long gun barrel slowly sweeping left to right. Behind it, the dark silhouette of the armored beast lurked, low and menacing, like a predator preparing to pounce. The German tank was stalking them. Their own main gun was still recovering from the shock of the last hit. The turret turned sluggishly. The loader hadn't rearmed yet. They had maybe 20 seconds, maybe less, before the next round would come. "We can't stay here. Joe, forward, now." Mitch shouted, but Joe didn't move. He focused on the periscope, then on the terrain behind them. There was a slight incline, muddy, uneven, but open enough. A patch of trees just ahead. Not much, but enough to buy them some time. The Tiger started to pivot. Joe made his decision. With no words, he grabbed a gear lever and slammed it into reverse. The first reverse kill. The Sherman lurched backward, its treads biting into the mud. The sound of the engine roaring, the rattle of loose bolts filling the tank. The crew was thrown against their seats, their voices rising in confusion. "Joe, what the hell are you doing?" Mitch yelled. "Hold on," Joe replied calmly, a steely focus in his voice. "We're not running. We're repositioning." Repositioning, backwards. No one had time to argue. Another shell slammed into the earth just in front of them, spraying dirt across the periscope. The tank shuddered violently. The sound of the blast echoed like thunder splitting the ground. The shockwave hit Joe's chest, but he held steady that he could feel the terrain through the vibrations beneath his boots. The mud was thick, uneven, but sloped downward just enough to give them cover. Joe guided the Sherman backward, maneuvering through smoke and dust, turning slightly to use the burning wreckage of Red 5 as cover. The Tiger fired again, the shell tearing through the spot where their tank had been just moments earlier. Shards of dirt and metal rained down on them. Inside the tank, Ellis whispered, "If we'd stayed, we'd be gone." Joe didn't answer. He was too focused. The periscope view was pure chaos. Trees, smoke, flashes of light, then darkness. But Joe wasn't looking at what was in front of him. He was imagining what the Tiger driver was seeing. Confusion, movement, targets shifting through the haze. A Sherman that refused to follow the expected pattern, but he remembered something his father used to tell him while teaching him to drive the old farm tractor. The trick to reversing isn't looking back. It's knowing where you came from. Those words echoed in Joe's mind as he yanked the lever again, sending the Sherman sliding deeper into fog. He cut a sharp left, using Red 5's burn remains as temporary cover. The German tank, assuming it had destroyed the last threat, began to move forward slowly, confidently, like a predator that thought its kill was guaranteed. "Loader." Joe barked. "High explosive loaded." Mitch responded, slamming the shell into the breech. "Forget high explosive," Joe said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Armor piercing, now." Mitch hesitated for a split second, then nodded. "Copy that." The Tiger emerged again, its massive form taking shape through the smoke. The 88mm gun moved slowly, deliberately, with a kind of precision that sent shivers down the spine. For a brief moment, the two tanks faced each other, hunter and hunted. But only one was moving backward. Joe dropped the clutch, and the Sherman jolted. The crew braced themselves as they reversed faster, weaving between craters and debris. Ellis kept his hand steady on the turret crank, following Joe's lead. "Joe, I can't get a shot from this angle." "You will. Just trust me." Joe drove by instinct, feeling the slope beneath him, the mud clinging to the treads, the diesel stench thick in the air. Every bump rattled the hull. The engine groaned under pressure, but Joe kept the tank steady. He had to make the Tiger think they were retreating. Through the mirrors, Joe watched it move, slow, methodical, stalking them like a predator. He could almost hear the German gunner smirk. "Come on," Joe muttered. "Follow me." The Tiger fired. The shell whistled past them, missing by mere inches, and exploded behind them. The heat washed over the Sherman's rear armor. The crew choked on the smoke seeping through the vents. That was too close, Mitch muttered. Joe didn't reply. He pushed the Sherman faster, forcing the gears to whine under strain. Then, at the last possible second, he jerked the controls, sending the Sherman sideways down a narrow embankment. The Tiger followed, exactly as Joe had hoped. The German tank crept forward, its gun depressed, trying to maintain line of sight. But in doing so, it exposed its weakest point. The rear underside of its hull. Joe saw it immediately. "Stop!" he shouted. The Sherman screeched to a halt, mud splashing against the hull. "Turret 9 o'clock. Armor-piercing loaded." "Loaded," Ellis replied, already swinging the gun into position. Joe exhaled slowly. "Take the shot." The cannon roared. The entire tank shook from the force of the recoil. Smoke poured into the interior, momentarily blinding the crew. For a moment, no one could see anything. Then, through the haze, a bright orange burst lit up the Tiger's rear. Direct hit. The German tank shuddered, then erupted in a violent explosion, igniting its ammunition. The blast rumbled through the forest, scattering birds and leaves in all directions. Fragments of metal rained down, hissing as they hit the damp ground. Inside Joe's tank, there was only silence. The crew stared at one another, wide-eyed and open-mouthed. "Did we just—" Mitch began. "Yeah," Ellis answered softly. "We did." Joe didn't smile. He simply watched the flames devouring the Tiger. The flickering light of the fire danced across his face, reflecting in his eyes like tiny suns. "Reload," Joe said quietly. "We're not done." The radio crackled with static, followed by a broken voice. A Sherman commander, somewhere behind them. "Unit Bravo. Report. Way pinned down. Tigers in the tree line." Joe grabbed the MiC-1 Tiger down, moving to support. The voice hesitated. "Say again." "You destroyed a Tiger." Joe didn't repeat himself. He just shifted gears. As they moved backward through the smoke, the crew began to breathe again. Mitch laughed nervously, shaking his head. "Backtrack, Joe. Holy hell, man. You really are going to fight the Nazis in reverse." Ellis wiped the sweat from his forehead, grinning. "I'll drink to that when we get out of here." Joe didn't answer. His focus stayed ahead, or rather, behind. The battlefield was alive with fire and noise. The enemy would regroup quickly. The element of surprise was already fading. But in that brief window, something had changed. The Tiger, the machine that every Allied soldier feared, was no longer invincible. It could burn. It could be beaten. The radio crackled again. Shouts, coordinates, orders, chaos. Joe barely listened. His mind was calculating, moving faster than ever. The reverse tactic had worked once, but the enemy would learn. He needed to think quicker, drive smarter, and use every advantage the terrain offered. Mitch glanced at Joe, studying his face. "You knew that would work, didn't you?" Joe shrugged slightly. "Didn't know. Just figured it might." "That's insane," Mitch muttered. "Maybe, but it's better than dying in a straight line." Ellis chuckled weakly, still shaken. "You know, Joe, when you said we'd be the only guys to win a battle going backward, I thought you were kidding." "I never kid about survival," Joe replied. The sound of distant gunfire echoed through the hedge. The scent of burning fuel and scorched grass filled the air. Somewhere, another explosion rumbled. The second Tiger was still out there, still hunting. Joe tightened his grip on the controls. "Let's move," he said. "We've got work to do." As the Sherman backed deeper into the mist, the crew followed the rhythm of the engine, the heartbeat of metal and courage. They didn't know it yet, but this was just the beginning. In less than 20 minutes, Joe Johnson's insane reverse tactic will become a legend whispered in every Allied camp in Normandy. And though Joe didn't believe in glory, fate had already marked his name for something much bigger, a single act of defiance that would echo long after the smoke cleared. Because in war, courage doesn't always charge forward. Sometimes it drives in reverse. The reverser, a legend is born. News of the Tiger kill spread faster than the smoke itself. Joe didn't talk much over the radio, but the story got around anyway. A Sherman had taken out a Tiger in reverse. That was the part everyone repeated, almost like a punchline. "Did you hear? Some guy backed into a tiger and blew it to hell." By nightfall, the name had already stuck. The Reverser. Joe didn't care. He wasn't looking for nicknames. His mind was still focused on the second tiger. They had pulled back to a temporary regroup point in a hedgerow hollow hidden under tree cover. One tank lost, 2 others damaged. The unit's commanding officer, Lieutenant Keading, arrived in a jeep, caked in mud, demanding a report. "You really took out a tiger?" he asked, disbelief in his voice. "Yes, sir," Joe answered simply. "With what?" Keading asked, still skeptical. "A lucky shot." "No, sir," Joe replied, "with positioning." Keading stared at him, trying to understand. Joe didn't fit the mold. He wasn't loud. He wasn't cocky. He stood there in his oil-stained uniform, his face streaked with ash and sweat, calm as if he'd just changed a tire. Keading looked down at the map spread across the tank's front hull. "We've got another tiger stalking the valley road. Canadians are taking a beating," Keading said. "If you've got another one of those positions in mind, now's the time." Joe leaned in and studied the map like a chess player analyzing 5 moves ahead. "There's a shallow ridge here," he said, pointing with his grease-streaked finger. "If we loop through this orchard, we can reverse down the far side and hold this line. It's the only way we'll get a shot at its rear again." Keading raised an eyebrow. "You're serious? You want to lead with your tail?" Joe didn't blink. "That's where the advantage is." Keading stepped back, silent for a moment. Then he nodded once. "You've got 10 minutes. Joe returned to his crew. "They're already prepping the tank," Mitch said. "Armor-piercing loaded," Ellis added. "Turret recalibrated. It's a bit off-center, but she'll hold." Joe climbed into the driver's seat. The controls were slick with grime. His hands were cracked and shaking, but his voice was steady. "We're going to flank from behind," he told them. "We'll use the orchard for cover. Once we clear the ridge, we reverse down the slope slowly. I want that tiger thinking we're just another straggler running scared." Ellis laughed dryly. "You want us to look like cowards so we can act like killers." "Something like that." They rolled out with engines low, the soft ground muffling the sound of their treads. Ahead, the orchard loomed, gnarled apple trees, their leaves singed by shell fire, fruit blackened and hanging in twisted clusters. Smoke swirled between the trunks like a curtain, obscuring the view. The Sherman eased into position, the tank moving slowly backward, its tracks biting into the dirt with practiced precision. Joe's eyes flicked between the mirrors and the feel of the slope beneath them, calculating each shift. Behind the ridge lay the valley road, and beyond that, the second tiger. Through the periscope, they saw it, the massive silhouette of another German tank, angled slightly to the left. Its gun pointed uphill toward a Canadian convoy retreating in haste. Distant gunfire rattled in the air, and tracer rounds cut through the mist, the red blooms barely visible in the smoke. The tiger was in control, untouchable, until now. Joe kept reversing, slow and controlled, 1 foot of terrain at a time. The trick wasn't just a move. It was to not look like a threat. To look broken, panicked, like prey. "Almost there," Joe murmured. Ellis had the turret trained, and Mitch stood ready with the next shell. Every muscle in the tank was wound tight, waiting. That's when Joe saw it. The moment, the exact second when the tiger pivoted to adjust its aim. The rear armor flashed into view, an exposed target. "Fire," Joe ordered. The cannon roared. The round left the barrel with a crack that split the air. There was a breathless pause. Then a burst of flames erupted from the rear of the tiger. Direct hit. But it wasn't enough. The shell punched through the engine deck, bursting into fire. Yet the tiger didn't stop. It shuddered, turned, wounded, but still alive. Its turret began to swing, slow and menacing, tracking their position. Inside Joe's tank, there was no sound, no words. "Reload. Armor-piercing." Joe barked. "Already on it." Mitch replied, slamming another shell into the breech, his hands blistered from the heat. Ellis twisted the turret crank, fighting resistance as a hydraulic struggled from overuse. The tiger turned, fully aware of the threat behind it. The Germans knew they weren't chasing shadows anymore. This wasn't a lucky shot. They were being hunted by someone who understood them. "Hold it," Joe whispered, keeping the Sherman half exposed on the slope, its rear hidden behind the broken tree stumps. The front of the tank caught the glow of the burning Tiger shell, then the German gun flashed. A shell screamed past them, missing by inches, and struck a stone wall behind them. The explosion rocked the Sherman like a drum being kicked. Joe bit his tongue, tasting blood. "Shoot now or we're done." Mitch yelled, "Ellis." Joe began, but Ellis didn't wait. The second shot roared from the cannon, a blur, a thunderclap. This time, the shell hit lower, under the turret, between the armor plates. It detonated with a force that seemed almost predestined. The Tiger didn't just explode. It disintegrated. The turret flew into the air like a discarded helmet. Flames poured from every seam, and the tank rocked sideways, slamming against the road's edge. Ammunition cooked off one by one, deafening booms filling the air. For a moment, the fire turned blue. Inside Joe Sherman, the crew sat in stunned silence. The Tiger, the myth, the beast that every Allied soldier feared, was gone. Burning, broken, beaten. Mitch slumped against the hull, his hands shaking. "That's two. Two goddamn Tigers." Ellis let out a nervous laugh, then coughed, staring at the flames. Joe didn't say anything. His gaze remained on the burning wreckage, his expression unreadable. Then the shockwave hit. An unseen German artillery shell, maybe aimed blindly, maybe just bad luck, landed not 10 feet from their left tread. The blast lifted the Sherman off its suspension, a burst of light, sound, and heat slamming into the crew like a wall. Everything went white. Joe's ears rang. His head slammed against the viewport. He felt warmth on his ribs. Not heat, wet warmth. Blood. Ellis was shouting, but Joe couldn't hear him. His vision blurred. Someone grabbed his arm. The tank hissed, something sparking inside. Mitch shouted into the radio, but the words came through as static. Joe blinked once, then twice, and looked down. A jagged piece of shrapnel was embedded in his side, just beneath his vest. Deep, dark blood poured through his shirt. It didn't hurt, not yet. It was cold. He slumped back into his seat, his hands still gripping the controls. Outside, the Tiger continued to burn. Its wreckage lit the fog in shades of orange and black. Beyond it, the Canadian convoy, battered but alive, began to move again. They were safe now because of him. "Joe," Ellis leaned down, his voice urgent. "Joe, you're hit. Say something." Joe blinked slowly, then gave a half smile. "Tell command. Objective secured." Mitch's voice cracked. "We need a medic. Now." "No time," Joe murmured. He turned his head slowly, looking out the small rear mirror. Smoke, fire, mud, destruction stretching back across the ridge, through the orchard, to the first Tiger. Everything they'd done, everything he'd driven through, backward. Joe chuckled softly, the sound weak and raspy. "I guess I really did fight the Nazis in reverse." His eyes began to close. Ellis grabbed his shoulder. "Hey, no, you stay with me. You hear me? You're not going out like this." But Joe was already somewhere else. The roar of engines faded. The fire became distant. He saw Nebraska's wheat fields, his dad's hands on a tractor wheel, the smell of diesel and fresh earth. He whispered his final words, "Tell my mom." I didn't back down. I backed him up. And then silence. A hero doesn't return. When the radio finally went silent, the war around them did not stop. Artillery rumbled somewhere beyond the valley. Smoke hung thick across the ridge like a shroud. The air smelled of burnt metal and gasoline, a scent that would never leave the skin. The Sherman sat half-buried in the mud, its armor scarred, its barrel still warm from the last shot. The crew had stopped shouting. There was nothing left to say. Ellis climbed halfway out of the hatch, gasping for air. He could hear distant cheering. The Canadian troops realizing the Tigers were gone. The road finally opened. But inside the tank, victory felt hollow. The world outside was moving forward, but Joe was not. Mitch was beside him, pressing a rag against Joe's wound, his hands slick with blood. "Stay with me, Joe. Hey, come on. You hear me? We made it." Joe's eyes fluttered open, his voice soft, strained by dust and pain. "Did we? Did they get through?" "Yeah," Mitch said quickly. "They're safe. You did it." A slow breath escaped Joe's chest, a sound somewhere between a sigh and a laugh. "Good," he whispered. For a few seconds, the three men sat in the stillness. No orders, no radios, just the soft hum of a dying engine. The fog outside glowed faintly orange from a burning Tiger wreck, casting long shadows inside the tank. Joe's hand slipped from the control lever and brushed the floor. He could feel the cold steel vibrating faintly, the heart of the machine still beating even as his own faltered. He looked at Mitch and Ellis, his eyes glassy but clear enough to find their faces. Don't be scared to back up," he murmured. "Sometimes that's the only way forward." Mitch swallowed hard. "Don't talk like that." But Joe smiled faintly, the kind of small, calm smile that meant he already knew. He tilted his head back, staring through the slit of the periscope. Above the drifting smoke, he caught a glimpse of open sky, pale blue, endless. It reminded him of home, Nebraska in summer, the smell of diesel from the old tractor, his mother's hands covered in flour, the sound of crickets at dusk. For a heartbeat, he wasn't in France at all. He was home. The noise of the battlefield faded into a quiet hum, like the slow turning of gears winding down. His breathing grew shallow. The blood on his chest was no longer warm. His fingers twitched once, as if shifting gears one last time. Then his hand went still. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died. For a long while, the crew didn't move. The only sound was the wind rustling through the shattered trees. Ellis finally lowered his head. Mitch looked down at the floor, lips trembling. Outside, the sun began to break through the fog. The light spilled across the valley, washing over the burned remains of the Tigers, the torn fields, and the battered Sherman that had refused to yield. Canadian medics arrived minutes later. They found 2 shaken soldiers and 1 fallen driver. They covered Joe with a torp and marked his name on the side of the tank with chalk. Private Joseph R. Johnson, killed in action. The Canadians would later say they'd seen bravery that day, but they couldn't quite describe it. How do you explain a man who fought the greatest tank of the war? By going backward. That night, as the smoke settled and silence crept back into Normandy, Ellis wrote a line in his notebook, words that no one would read until years later. He never looked like a hero. He just refused to let us die. He didn't retreat. He reversed the odds. The price of one life. Joe was buried 2 weeks later beneath a small apple tree near Common, his grave marked by a simple wooden cross with a helmet resting at its base. The Canadians insisted on conducting the ceremony. Joe's unit was too deep in the front lines to return. No speeches were made. No reporters. No grand military funeral. Just a low hum of wind in the orchard and the quiet scrape of shovels in the earth. But word of his actions spread quickly. They said he killed 2 tigers in under 10 minutes. They said he drove backward the entire time. They said he saved 37 men and opened a path that turned a stalled retreat into a counteroffensive. At first, officers dismissed it as rumor, until they saw the wreckage, spoke with the men, and found the body of a Tiger tank commander with a field map marked with Allied retreat lines, exactly where Joe had cut them off. Back home, the story made its way into the local newspaper in Seward County, Nebraska. The headline read, "Local farm boy turns the tide in France." His mother wept as she read it. She hadn't yet received the telegram. The War Department eventually confirmed his actions. He was posthumously awarded the Silver Star. The citation described extraordinary tactical improvisation under direct enemy fire. But the men who served with him didn't call it tactics. They called it guts. In the months that followed, crews across the front began to adopt what they jokingly called reverser drills, practicing backward retreats, using smoke to create blind zones, and targeting Tiger weak points from unconventional angles. In official training manuals, no one mentioned Joe, but among tankers, his name became shorthand for a certain kind of thinking, bold, unorthodox, desperate, but deliberate, the kind of thinking that saves lives. When the war ended, a group of soldiers returned to that ridge and replaced Joe's wooden cross with a stone marker, carved into the granite with just 3 lines, Private Joseph R. Johnson. He did not retreat. He reversed the odds. The field where he died grew quiet again, covered in wildflowers and rusted metal. But once a year, on the anniversary of the breakout from Normandy, a Canadian veteran would visit. He'd bring a small bottle of bourbon and place it on the stone. Then he'd sit for a while in silence because he knew what the report didn't say. Joe didn't just stop a tiger. He stopped the war's most feared beast by driving backward. Fear of winning. Would you dare to reverse? Most war stories end with medals, memorials, or parades. But not this one. This story ends on a slope in Normandy, where a weathered Sherman tank still rests beneath the overgrowth, its treads frozen in place, not pointed toward victory, but away from it. Backwards. Joe Johnson didn't write memoirs. He didn't return home to share his tale. No letters, no speeches, no grand declarations of triumph. What he left behind was a legacy, a trail of choices no one else had the courage to make, a strategy that no manual ever suggested. One pivotal moment where fear screamed to retreat, and instead, he stood his ground, choosing to turn around. It might have been reckless, maybe even suicidal, but it worked. Not because of luck, not because he was stronger, but because he saw what others couldn't. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is not charge ahead. Sometimes heroism sounds like the grind of gears in reverse. Sometimes saving 37 lives doesn't look like the hero's charge in a movie. And sometimes the man you mocked in training becomes a name you whisper when the battle darkens. So here's a question. In a world that glorifies moving forward, would you dare to stop? Would you dare to turn around? Not out of fear, but because it's the only way to save the ones behind you. Because true courage isn't always moving ahead. Sometimes it's knowing exactly when to take a step back. What surprised you the most? Drop your thought below. And never forget Joe, the reverser.